Hello, welcome everyone to the 2024 annual meeting of the Central Bank Research Association. We are very honored to be holding this at SAFE. The head of SAFE, is director or president of SAFE?
Academic director.
Academic director. Florian Heider, also a long-term member of the Central Bank and research community. We'll give a few words in a second, but I just, wanted to say it's great to be here because we've been here before, actually in the very same room 6 years ago. See some nodding. Some people have been with us then already, and it was a very important place for the history of the Central Bank Research Association, because we had our first annual meeting in 16 at Norges Bank, small workshop. Then a bigger workshop in the year afterwards at the Bank of Canada. We already had 2 parallel sessions, and we really saw that sort of this business model, a place for policy-relevant research in economics and finance, had a niche, that it really sort of fit in the landscape and that there was demand for this. And so there was this decision that we should go and enlarge the meeting and go to a more standard setup where you really have a number of parallel sessions. And then quickly you go beyond the scope of what central banks can host. So I looked around and I talked to ECB and I talked to Bundesbank, and I was made aware of this institute that was not yet a Leibniz Center. It had some different legal form, and we talked to the management. And we pulled it off. We made a meeting with 5 parallel sessions. It was more or less the same setup that we have now, where we have a few panels here in this room, and then the sessions taking place in the House of Finance, where you got your badge. And we received, for 100 papers, we received off the spot 500 submissions or 600. And so, it was a bit courageous, right, to scale up a meeting by a factor of 2.5, and it worked. And we haven't looked back since then. Obviously, due to Corona, we had to do some meetings virtual, which I don't know, kind of worked. We all remember, but then once you have the physical possibility, you know that there is a better thing than staying a full day on Zoom. And so, we were, after being here, we went to Columbia University, went to LSE, we went to MIT, we went to Barcelona, UPF, or Barcelona School of Economics, again Columbia, and now, after 6 years, we're back here. We're completing the circle, sort of. And it's a great honor to be here at SAFE under Florian Heider's stewardship. And I want to thank also Daniela Dimitrova, sitting there in the back, for the help this year, but also in the past years. We've actually always cooperated with SAFE. We also at CEBRA, we've increased our capacities. We have Doris Swift, who's also sitting there in the back, and Victoria Mallison, who is actually in Malaysia at the moment. And I want to thank all 3 of you for your amazing work and making this happen. And if you've seen CEBRA over the years, you've seen that we now have our own submission portal, right? That we're really investing in making this, in having this remain a relevant meeting, and I think and become even more relevant over time. Again, this year we had just shy over 1,000 submissions for like 100 or 120 papers. It's one of the most competitive meetings, so we're really also high quality. And I just want to thank all of you for submitting and presenting your work. We couldn't pull it off without people who really do the actual policy-relevant research. So thank you. With that, maybe let me just say one thing. Keep in mind, the panels will be recorded, and we'll put them on the YouTube channel after the meeting. They're not live. All the parallel sessions are at Chatham House, so there is a discussion, and you can report to the outside what the discussion is, but you cannot name names. And with that, let me hand over to Florian. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Raphael, and welcome everybody. It's my pleasure as the local organizer, well, not me, but people at SAFE, to welcome you here to our beautiful campus, which is, if you have a chance, I mean, you will definitely have to walk over to the House of Finance. I think something like that is pretty unique in Europe. As you may know, this was the headquarters of the American forces in Europe. And when everything was scaled down, it was given back to the state of Hessen. And the state of Hessen made the really wise, but maybe not economically amazing decision to give it to the university instead of developing it into, I don't know, 50 condominiums close to the city center. So we're very grateful for that. And you'll walk over to the House of Finance, which was built in 2008. So good timing. Where you'll have the parallel sessions, and also SAFE is in the House of Finance, so be very close to home on the first floor. On the second floor, we have the finance department. On the third floor, we have the macro people. And the House of Finance represents this idea of bringing research together as much as possible. Let me, I mean, Raphael alluded to this a little bit. Let me just say one or two words about SAFE. You know, what it is and what it stands for. So SAFE also was a child of the financial crisis. It was founded by professors at university wanting to think a little bit more about what's needed for a well-functioning financial system. And indeed, the name of SAFE stands for Sustainable Architecture for Finance in Europe. And this pretty much sums up our mission. Now, since 2020, we haven't moved, but we became something different. We became a Leibniz Institute. So that means that we are now a separate legal entity, formally separate from the university, but we like it here so much that we stay and we continue to stay. The Leibniz Association is one of the big government funding lines where they finance what they call non-university research. So it's still research, but why non-university? Because we try to do things that maybe at university are not so easy to do, or, you know, at least, you know, it's our mandate to do it. And there are two things. First of all, is to be a little bit more than finance, or interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, very, very modern words. But what it means that is, you know, finance is almost everywhere. We have it in economics, we have it in law, we have it in accounting, we have it in politics, very obvious when you talk about banks. So this is what we're trying to bring together. We have political scientists, we have lawyers at the Institute to go beyond the pure, narrow field of finance. And the second mandate that we have is outreach. Now, what does that mean? It means basically that we do research-based policy work. Like a lot of you who work in central banks, it's almost the same mission. It's just broader. We don't report to a board, but we report to maybe society, even though that's a big word. But we try to make finance known, which is a particularly steep hill to climb in Germany, where finance has a very bad connotations ever since a politician called some financial investors locusts. And we haven't recovered from that. So we are now at SAFE, we're 8 professors. We have 40 juniors with postdocs, PhDs. Altogether, about 80 people with the admin staff. And let me just thank 2 of them, Daniela up there and also Sabine, who've taken the brunt of organizing the organizing work at SAFE. So thanks a lot. You know, we couldn't do the research and the outreach without our fantastic admin staff. And finally, and with this I'll close, is that also, as Raphael alluded to, I've been in the central bank for almost 20 years of my professional life. So this is very dear to my heart. The conference is very dear to my heart. And I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces, friends, colleagues, former bosses. And with that, over to the panel. Thank you very much and welcome to Frankfurt.
It is a great pleasure to also be on the first panel. I guess that's one of the exorbitant privileges you get as president of CEBRA. But I actually have to step back. There's one person I forgot to thank, Raphael here in the first row, who's the scientific advisor for CEBRA and who actually is the core person putting together all the content of this meeting, that all the sessions chime together well, and panels and so forth. So thank you, Raphael. And now, let's see whether, no wait, escape. He explained it to me. Escape thing, Control L. Yes. So the value of economic research for policy, that's really a topic that's dear to my heart. I really like research, and I really think policy is important. And how can we sort of be relevant and be useful for policy? That's really a topic that sort of always has been featuring on my mind. And also, when you're around for a few years, you notice, right, that the importance of research fluctuates with current issues, and so it's a great pleasure to sort of moderate this panel with a great set of panelists. We have Catherine Mann. She's, they don't need any introduction. I'll give a short one anyway. She's currently an external MPC member at the Bank of England and also professor at Brandeis University. And previously she held many, many important positions, such as chief economist of the OECD and so forth. Thanks for joining us today. We have Luc Laeven, Director General of the ECB, Director General for Research of the ECB. So, with a long history, also previously at the IMF, of heading the fundamental or the core research unit in an important policy institution. And we have Diogo, who's the Deputy Governor for Monetary Policy at the Central Bank of Brazil. Again, thanks all of you for joining me today. Okay, unsurprisingly, I'm going to be speaking on my own behalf and not on the role of the BIS. And, I just wanted to lead this off with an important question. PhDs really in economics, or economists in general, and obviously for finance too and related studies, really take an important position in central banking. And if you compare it to other institutions, right, that's really unique. And actually, can we take this for given, right? For me, like, I came out of the PhD program. It was just the case that many governors had an econ PhD. But if you look a bit back in time, that's actually not, like in here, a case in point, the US. That's actually not anything that always used to be the case. So if we look at the 49 composition of the FOMC, there was one economist, and the vast majority of educational backgrounds were actually lawyers. Then we see over time that shift with this dominance of PhDs, and then, by coincidence, I found this other newspaper heading. The first one is from the Harvard Business Review from 2014, and in 2014, the FT titles "The Fading Fed Reign of Economics PhDs." Now, who knows whether that's a fluctuation or a trend, but I just think the importance is to remind oneself it hasn't always been that way, and it's not granted that it'll stay that way. And I think also there are some structural issues, right? On the one side, central banks and related IFIs and policy institutions have this unique sort of analytical culture. You have access to vetted stuff. that are trained in quantitative methods, that are trained in thinking at the margin and in general equilibrium. And also, right, you can gauge a CV to some extent by just looking at a set of publications, right? There are well-established journal ranking citations. Now we know, right, all of this has to be taken with a grain of salt, but it's still unique if you compare it, like in my position, I hire engineers, I hire policy staff, and I hire economists, and it's just much easier to gauge a CV just from what is listed from the document with economists, because there is a clear, we have a clear vetting. But on the other side, obviously, academic approaches may not always be aligned with policy objectives, right? Academic research being, having working papers that get cited or download, or journals that published in journals that are highly ranked, is not in itself a policy goal. It's an intermediate goal to achieve something different, which is good economic policy. And then, right, we understand that there is sort of the novelty dominates the policy relevance. Editors or referees might perpetuate certain approaches. And when you're inside that thinking, there is always the danger that you sort of go native on the models and fail to abstract from the assumptions that it makes, and that these are simplifications, and they may not be useful for extrapolating in many situations. And so, this has real repercussions. I would cite the inability of most models to forecast the global financial crisis or the recent inflation burst as, some of the symptoms of sort of this misalignment of what it means to do good policy and what it means to be sort of by academic measures, successful central bank economist. And I think, when we think at the margin, we should also solve this at the margin. And the way we do this is by aligning sort of the incentives with the objectives. And we can do this. The Central Bank Research Association is one of the examples that does this. It says, we want to run a high-quality meeting, but we want policy relevance to feature more broadly than elsewhere. And there are other examples, the International Journal of Central Banking, the International Banking Research Network, and many other things. So some people here in the room have launched really relevant initiatives. And there's one further thing I want to point out. We also can think about different impact metrics. With Christian Zimmermann of REPEC and Giulio Cornelli from the BIS, we did a journal ranking based on central bank citation. It's a very simple idea. You look at REPEC. REPEC counts impact factors by just saying, well, here's the number of items that a journal publishes, 100 articles, and it has 1,000 citations in REPEC. So that's the impact factor is 10. But you say in the numerator, I'm only counting the citations that are made in central bank outlets, like the working paper series, like the policy briefs, policy papers. So obviously the impact factor will be smaller because you only count a subset, but more importantly, the relative ranking will change. And I want to conclude by just giving you sort of these rankings. We see, some common names. We see a surprise with the Brookings papers on economic activity. I'm not sure if that we show it for different time periods. There is, maybe some fluctuations as with any rankings, but if we sort of, here's just the top 10, I think the key features overall are that sort of the top 5 journals in economics, what is generally considered a general interest journal in economics, also features in this ranking. So these also dominate the top. Obviously, the specialist journalists like the JME or the AJ Macro, they receive a bump because they're more specialized. But, for example, one striking thing here, you see it, there is no top finance journal in this top 10, and this is a general pattern, is that these top 3 finance journals do not fare well in this ranking, probably because they publish a lot of stuff on asset pricing or corporate. And instead it's the Journal of Financial Intermediation who in one of these rankings was actually the top-ranked finance journal. And then last, there are many subtle differences, but last you see the IJCB being in the top 10, being on number 8. So that demonstrates, right, that the IJCB really lived up to its purpose. So, it's a success story. And I want to conclude here. Catherine will be next. And then we'll have Luc, the former editor of the IJCB. He can maybe brag a bit. And then we have Diogo. Thank you. And let me actually go to... No. So, all yours.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to come to talk about economic research for policymakers. I started my career on your side. I was part of the economics research staff at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. I was there for about 10 or 12 years. And the system committee meetings brought together economists from around the Federal Reserve system to compare notes on the research that was being done in service to the policymaking community of the FOMC and the bank presidents. So I'm very familiar with being on your side. Now, I've taken a few turns. I went through think tanks. I was endowed chair professor for a while, chief economist at the OECD, chief economist at Citibank, which was that's my finance credibility. And then I circled back to become a policymaker at the Bank of England in one of the external positions. And I think the Bank of England is unique, not quite unique, but almost unique in having foreigners, you can tell I'm not British, foreigners being part of the monetary policy making process. It could be considered kind of controversial. I mean, I'm not a citizen, and I do live there, but I don't have a mortgage. And so, how could I possibly understand what is going on in the UK economy to be part of the monetary policy making decision body? But of course, the whole point is that there are external factors and outside research insights that can be brought to bear and married with the material and the research that is prepared within the Bank of England. Oh, the clicker works. The clicker is where? Okay. Okay. You can drive. No, I like to drive. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the research that has been informative for me as a policymaker. And all of the research that I'm going to be talking about here is research that I've cited in speeches. Why? Because the credibility of the institution is the quality of its research. It's the currency of our profession. And getting it out there, getting it published, at minimal in a speech, for which there's a document that people can refer to, and hopefully going beyond that into one of these journals, that creates credibility for my policymaking decisions. So I'm only as good as the research that comes from my team. And so to me, it's very important to both communicate what are important research interests, to use the research that comes my way, to encourage additional research, and to cite it and make it public. Because as I say, the credibility of the decision-making process, the credibility of the institution is, in my view, at stake. This was true at the OECD and sort of true at Citibank, although they didn't like to have anything made public because they always wanted to have everybody pay for things. In any case, inflation dynamics have been the focus of my last 2.5 years as a policymaker. Obviously, the type of shock has been relevant, but I'm going to focus on these last three: inflation expectations, inflation persistence, and the transmission mechanism of monetary policy to inflation, because I only think I have 7 minutes, which I'm probably going to go over, but anyway. So let's talk about this first topic, inflation expectations. How does the research inform my decision on monetary policy? So I'm going to focus on this issue of forward versus backward-looking expectations and expectation formation. So what this diagram is showing you is that forward versus backward-looking matters for monetary transmission, for inflation persistence, and the sacrifice ratio. These are things that are meat and potatoes for us as central bankers. So in macroeconomic models, there's typically only one inflation expectation. But of course, in the real world, it's not just the average one that you might get off of Ipsos or something, but the whole distribution of inflation expectations. It also matters whether we are looking at households, firms, or financial markets. These are different expectations. They have different relationships to the monetary policy transmission mechanism. One of my team members wrote her master's thesis for her central banking master's on the differences in how these 3 different agents responded to monetary policy shocks, and it was really quite an interesting master's thesis. Is currently coming out as a working paper. Now, lastly, for the functioning of monetary policy, it also matters how these expectations are formed. So the chart that I'm showing you there comes from a speech from February 2023, where basically I showed the ability of monetary policy to affect inflation varies with the degree of backward-lookingness. So we could parameterize a standard New Keynesian model with nonlinearities and a shifting curve to yield this story in here about how inflation responded to a cost-push shock under a balanced Taylor rule. If we had many backward-looking firms, you can see that inflation is persistent and it is much higher than one where we have a fully forward-looking rational expectations environment, which is in the aqua. The difference between the aqua and the purple is not just linear, because we can move from fully forward-looking rational expectation agents in the aqua and move in standard steps to the orange and to the purple. And what you're seeing here is it's nonlinear in the sacrifice ratio as the share of backward-looking firms increases. So this becomes a very important input to wanting to understand where persistence comes from and how inflation expectations are formed. So usually, this is a theoretical exercise. Usually for inflation expectations, we go look at some surveys, or maybe we look at some of the yield curve or other financial market measures, which we do that too. But what I've done in this chart is to show you a relationship between the data and the share of forward-looking and backward-looking agents. Now, the speech that I referred to was calibrated, but the calibration comes from this analysis, which uses a methodology from Cornea, Mardia, and Madeira, who use a time series of UK inflation and can decompose it into, quote, quote, fundamentalists, meaning forward-looking in the Phillips curve, versus backward-looking. Now, agents select a particular forecasting rule, forward or backward, depending on how that rule has performed well for them, so it's disaggregated for them recently. There are information costs, so sometimes it is better off, meaning cheaper, to look backward versus looking forward and forecasting. So what this does, though, in terms of this methodology of these authors who are now at the University of in Lisbon, but they were in the UK when they wrote this, and we've been working with them since the original article was produced, it makes expectations formation endogenous to monetary policy, an interesting situation to be in. Now, you can see here by the stocks that there are relationships between the degree of forward-looking agents, which is the vertical axis, and certain macroeconomic events, like energy crises. Now this is you know, you kind of look at that and you say, aha, well, forward-looking agents tend to be, or the more forward-looking agents tend to be during periods of relatively low inflation, for example, in the Great Moderation period and after the global financial crisis. But we can also show, using more technical methodology, which I'm just going to briefly mention here, the technical methodology meaning we can relate the share of forward-looking firms to the actual oil shocks using local projection methods, and to show that if we have inflationary supply shocks, inflation expectation formation tends to become more backward-looking, especially in the short run. And this becomes important for monetary policy making. The chart is an example of this impulse response function of the share of forward-looking agents in an environment of a positive oil shock. So let me turn now to the second topic, which is inflation persistence. Now, this is a critical question. How, you know, we've had some shocks. They pushed inflation up. How long is it going to take to get us down? How long is it going to take us to get us back to our 2% objectives? Is it going to take a long time? Is it going to take a short time? And what do we need to know about persistence as part of the monetary policy decision-making process? So what we have here is a methodology that marries a theoretical Phillips curve structure with machine learning within a nested tree format. So the underpinnings of this is an open economy, new Keynesian, nonlinear Phillips curve. So it's both nonlinear, it can also shift. It uses a boosted tree method to forecast 1 month ahead CPI. The blocks in this Phillips curve structure has an inertia, which is characterized, or that block, there's a block for inertia. Well, you can see what they are by looking at the different colors. There's an inertial block, there's a financial market block, monetary policy shock block, demand block, and supply block. Each one of those blocks has a machine learning component to it that uses as input monthly data. So for example, in the inertial block, there is backward-looking versus forward-looking agents, so that material I just showed you, wages, inflation expectations for core and services, as well as some of the CPI price components. In the demand block, just kind of references, we've got some PMIs in there, we've got slack in there, we've got some labor market stuff in there. Financial conditions, just for reference, financial conditions index, another piece of work that that I'll show you in a minute, exchange rates, and some house prices. So we train each of the block within the 5 blocks on the set of empirical data, and then we spit out what the drivers of CPI inflation have been over time and what they are currently. So what you can look at in particular is there was a lot of demand and supply components during the run-up to of the inflation over the last couple of years, but I train your attention on the inertial components, which is in the purple, and the role that that plays in the inflation process that we are looking at today. That inertial component has remained even as the supply shocks, which is in orange, and the demand shocks, which are the opening up after COVID, those inertial components have remained and have become a larger share of the overall inflation dynamics. And understanding that inertial component is a critical ingredient to my decision about how long I have to remain restrictive in my monetary policy decision making. So let's talk about where that inertial component might come from. Now, this, it could come from a variety of different places, but this is digging into firms' price-setting behavior. It is asymmetric depending on their competitors' price-setting behavior. Again, this is all research that's been done within the Bank of England that I've cited in speeches and is therefore available in the public domain. As I say, I think this contributes to an understanding of how central bank research is part of it. You know, we don't just make up our decisions. We do a lot more than just that. So what is it that's happening in this chart here? So the teal are telling you how a firm pushes up its own prices when it thinks it's going to get a higher price next period. The orange is how a firm changes its prices in expectation based on their competitors' prices. So the teal basically says, if a firm thinks it's going to increase in prices next period, it actually does. So it's pretty good on understanding its own pricing dynamic. On the other hand, with the orange, that is, how do they change their prices based on what their competitors do? And in that case, when prices are going up, they change their prices. When prices are going down, there's a negative on the coefficient, but it's within a confidence band. So the bottom line on this price-setting behavior is that when a firm expects competitors to raise price faster than it intended to, it will adjust its prices faster to meet competitors. So there is a rightward bias to the inflation process, or a ratchet in the price level, that is important when we think about the underlying dynamics of the inflation process itself. Meaning, I have to be restrictive for longer in this environment. Now, this inertial, we can also talk about this type of behavior in the context of wage growth and labor markets. We are quite familiar with that, with real wage rigidity, but I think it's important to note that it's not just a labor market phenomenon, but also a profit margin or a firm market phenomenon that creates upward bias to the inflation process. I am going to skip this, but just to say that all that stuff about forward and backward looking is equally relevant for issues, for example, of how climate policies get integrated into the inflation process. So we can talk about that. So moving on to the transmission mechanism, monetary policy transmission mechanism. So many models of the monetary policy transmission, MTM, are specified as deltas. The delta on the policy rate transmits to the delta on financial conditions, to the delta on the interest rate that may be relevant for financial markets. Now, an important question is, do the deltas really drive decision-making agents, whether it be households making decisions about mortgages, whether to take on a mortgage or not, or change their purchasing power based on the mortgage, or firms choosing whether to invest or not? Is it the deltas or is it the levels? So an important factor when thinking about deltas versus levels is to take account of initial conditions. So a lot of the models take the initial condition of the policy rate as 0, because that was the zero lower bound. And so you add on 500 basis points on top of that, it seems like, you know, a ginormous increase in restrictiveness of monetary policy. But if you take the view that initial conditions were actually quite a bit easier than implied by the zero lower bound, it's why we have come to call it an effective lower bound, because of course it's well below 0. And in the context of the United Kingdom, a monetary conditions index, this is a financial conditions index broader than that, a monetary conditions index alone put the effective policy rate at negative 350 when we started our hiking cycle. Not at 0.15 basis points, but negative 350. So that means you add on 500 basis points, which was basically what we did in the hiking cycle. You know, it does not have the same tone to it as starting at 0, adding 500. You get a different number than starting at negative 350 and adding on 500. Again, Monetary Policy Conditions Index is available on a Bank Underground publication. So I'm almost done. The second point about transmission mechanism that I think is critical to incorporate into our thought process is state dependency. Now, what I've done here, my research staff has done, is to evaluate an important state dependency of monetary policy as it relates to wage growth. Why wage growth? Well, services price inflation has been the most persistent category of inflation, and it is particularly exposed to wage inflation due to the composition of the cost function. So using the local projection, the methodology, they look at the impact of monetary policy shocks on aggregate variables, and what you can see here in a low inflation, low unemployment environment, which is the blue line, monetary policy has less traction to reduce wage inflation, and therefore has less traction to reduce services price inflation too, which again tells me, as a policymaker, under a state dependency of this nature, which is characterized by the state we are in the United Kingdom, you have to remain restrictive for longer. So let me finish by saying a couple things about how to get it done. So I've been talking a lot about the research that has been done because I talk a lot in our meetings about what I think the important issues are. And researchers listen, and they go off and do research. So that communication strategy has worked very well in the context of the Bank of England. Different central banks have different relationships between their policymakers and the staff, but that communication has to take place. If you don't know what I care about, then how can I complain if you're doing something that I think is irrelevant? I have to communicate to you what I think are the important issues. That said, I have my scouts who are out there finding people who are working on things. So it's not like you just have to, some of it is you have to come to me and say, you're working on things that you think are relevant and why. So it's a two-way process. But below that communication, this next set of things are super critical. We have got to get away from our standard macro model assumptions and methods. Linear, symmetric. We're done with that. We've got to encourage methodologies that are much more innovative. I've showed you machine learning, which I know some people don't like, but I think you can marry it with our theoretical constructions. Disaggregated data. We're done with the national accounts, whether you have problems with them or not. We are done with the national accounts. You need to have deciles. If you're talking about households, you've got to look at firm-level data. You've got to look at disaggregated CPI. Just disaggregate, disaggregate, disaggregate. Test for nonlinearity, state dependencies, and asymmetry. The assumption is these exist, not these don't exist. These exist. It's a question of how strong they are. It may be that this research that I've shown you, which is little pieces, it's like a part of a mosaic. I've shown you several pieces of a mosaic of how that research informs my decision making. I have to bolt it on to the macro models that I currently use. So what do I think is interesting right now? Just to finish, 3 words: volatility, distributions. That is critically important going forward for the MTM and for R-star. Spillovers. We are entering an environment where policy rate divergence is going to be with us for a while. And there's also divergence in how various central banks are approaching balance sheet reduction and the financial market interventions to, in the case of getting to the ample reserves management position. It's a global capital market. If there are different tools that central banks are using to navigate getting to the right size balance sheet, you know that there's going to be arbitrage opportunities that the markets are going to take advantage of. Thank you.
have to do this in German? There's no control. That will be advice number one, move everything into English. So I was asked to talk about research for policy. Thanks to Raphael for the invitation. And so what I'm going to do is, so think of Kathy's introduction as examples of useful research. I'm going to take a step back and my 5 cents worth of, if you're an incoming PhD and you basically enter a completely new world coming from grad school into this policy-making institution, what are some pieces of advice I would have for you? Because unfortunately, in these wonderful institutions we call universities, they don't devote that much attention to that. I do this from my position of running a research department in the central bank, which has a mandate that consists of 2 parts: do fundamental research and provide research-based policy advice to the decision-making bodies. So the first part is publish, and the second is what we're talking about today. The 2 are intrinsically linked because good research underpins good policy. I think Kathy gave good examples of that. Flip side of that is bad links to bad, right? So I think what is really important is that with research, although policymakers often want precision and basically numbers, we're actually not that good at that. What we're much better at is narratives, and those are only developed with strong theoretical underpinnings. And so at the ECB, I'm very happy that we're very careful trying to keep a healthy balance between theory and empirics. Because only with a model you can really talk about trade-offs, and ultimately that's what happens in policy. It's ultimately some sort of decision that comes out of these committees where not everyone sings the same tune or looks at the same model, or may even look at models, or may even be an economist, although the world has changed, according to Raphael. Ultimately, what it does is it helps battle the terrible twins we face in empirical macro, or finance for that matter. It's endogeneity and identification, and it's not only the 2 comments that you're for sure going to get it from a referee, that's also what you face in reality. And so I think the emphasis is much more on, rather than producing one model with one set of results, is to run counterfactuals. And it's important both to analyze ex post, what is the effective policy, but also ex ante, what would be the impact of a new policy prior to launching it. That's the most difficult one, because there's very little time to provide these answers, but that's the reality. Now, I want to pause here for a moment, because it all sounds like, okay, you do good research and that's good policy, and flows from that. The world is much more complicated, and actually there's an intrinsic conflict between the 2, and I think we have to acknowledge that, and everything I have to say is with that caveat in mind. And the limits are basically threefold. So one is a time dimension. Policymakers want to have answers today, and you can only provide them tomorrow. Often you end up having to give uncomfortable messages to policymakers, because in the end it's also politics, and they may not want to hear them, or may not want to hear them at that point in time. They throw you out one day, they call you back next month, and you need to develop some skin for that. And sometimes you just have to have the guts to say, I don't know. And that's the way you also build up credibility. You don't do that in a seminar, but you have to do that at times in the policymaking world. But the other thing I want to say is that there's this beautiful little pamphlet of a book called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. There should also be room for that. For not all research that you do at a central bank should be focused on what Kathy finds interesting today. You should also try to think what she should be thinking about tomorrow. And there should be a healthy balance between the 2. Okay, so now I think the value of research has changed and improved dramatically, and always increases when there are new shocks. So they're bad for the world, bad for our health sometimes, or for our pocket, but they're great for research. And First time I talked about these issues was the global financial crisis, and now we can mention COVID, inflation, burst, etc. They give us room for thought and demand for research. And what it means is that policymakers are in uncharted territory and therefore have to draw heavily on your research. And if you're clever enough, you can provide answers to that. You have to be fast. This can also help you in terms of having some first mover advantage into then also publishing that work. Now, why, this is a general statement about academic research. Why do you need then research in central banks? At times, academia moves very slow. They have other perverse incentives in terms of their publication prospects, and it's better to focus on the latest fad or what you can deliver on, and sometimes these current issues or more difficult questions are left out. Also, singular research is not always best equipped to deal with the more multidimensional policy demands that one faces. One has to often think in terms of second best, etc. And it's not always that easy to publish. And indeed, often policy work starts with a very particular question and then evolves, and it's only a portion of it that ultimately gets published. Now, I'm a firm believer, but not everyone agrees, and you don't have to agree, that's totally fine, but I do believe that there are synergies between research and policy. Most graduates, when they join, they think they're just totally at odds with one another. I want to protect my research time, etc. I think my advice always is, A, if you don't like policy at all, you're probably in the wrong place. B, try to look for synergies here. The more you can find these synergies, the happier and more productive you will be. Now, think about some of these possible synergies. First, you have access to wonderful ideas from policymakers. You have access to great data, so you can be first mover advantage. You can have a first mover advantage. Now, also, what policy work often does is it pushes you out of your comfort zone, out of being an expert on topic Y into trying to say something on another topic. And then you can meet also new people and get into more interdisciplinary stuff. In the end, what it can result in is some form of learning that, of course, an academia can do too, but often it means that you go on sabbatical or basically move. In the end, what I'm talking about is you face new topics, new approaches, new people. I think that is very important. And in the end, we're in an intellectually curious profession, and you need to find a way to keep learning. And the last thing is policy work can give very healthy pressures and deadlines to generate these ideas, okay? I take a bit of time, sorry, Raph, but because I will leave out most of it. I'll put it on the, so one question that always comes up is, why do you need research in a central bank, and how do you organize it? Should it be separate? I think this is a kind of useless discussion at some level, because basically I've seen both models can work, whether you have a separate or not. Well, what is, I think is important is that you have to, it's all about having the right people in the right place, some incentives in place. And what is important is that you protect research time of staff and that you have management in place that supports research. Striking the right balance between policy and research. So the moment you are in the central bank and you get this exciting interaction with policymakers, it can become a drug for some. And this you have to self-manage and self-regulate, because ultimately you will not survive as a researcher also in these policy institutions without continuing to do research. And so I think it's important to focus on your comparative advantage, which often has to do with focusing on medium-term policy issues and trade-offs. Make sure you're known in your area of expertise throughout your career and find these matches between research and policy. Actively manage your time, so block your calendars, basically. And then what I see as the comparative advantage today of a central bank researcher is, I spoke about this a bit, you can have this first mover advantage by being exposed to the policy area. There is all this microdata, often it's proprietary, and the ECB is going into that. The Fed has been in that world for a very long time. And then often it is very useful to actually know what you're talking about, have the innate workings of a financial market, be it repos, collateral, payment systems, or how the unconventional monetary policy actually works, how does R star come about, or R without star, etc. And so you have all these experts, the plumbers, across the aisle, and you can go and talk to them and find out how the real world works. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you for the invitation. My slides here will be a bit different in the sense that I think Catherine provided like the glass half full view of how research can help policy. Luc provided the governance, how it can help. I'll bring a little bit more like the open questions. Where do I think research could provide more answers than it's been providing? So it's going to be a bit more of a, I don't know if it's a negative, but it's a more tentative kind of questions. So first, to start off, we all agree research is relevant. As Luc was saying, good research is the foundation for good policy. The beautiful way of saying is endogeneity, identification. The easiest way of saying it organizes the discussion, right? Without having a good research, all the arguments can be flawed. So I think it starts with the research, the whole debate on policy. The second point is on governance. I think Luc mentioned quite a bit on that. There's this split on how much policy and how much research. It's easier said than done. There's always a hard deadline for policy. Then when you realize you're doing only policy work, and I think there's a lot to blame on policymakers. They put the priority on policy. They don't have the patience to wait for research. So with hard deadlines, short deadlines, it all becomes a bit of a policy work. So putting the blame on me, for instance, on that one. And the third, relating to Catherine, on communication. I think communication both inside, how policymakers and the staff discuss research matters a lot to think about the relevant policy questions, and also outside, you know, to provide outlets that can be more timely. For instance, I think many central banks have been putting out blog posts. I think this has been quite useful to provide what's the research being done inside. It's not like a working paper or a publication that it's important but takes quite a while. But for instance, bringing up the idea what's important, it's also important using blogs. And agreeing with the others mentioned, research at a central bank has quite some advantages. First, to think about policy questions, but also data, right? Data and the environment to think about these questions and how to use the data. So let me go straight to my point. So I agree with you how research has been providing important insights. These are just some examples of it. State-dependent pass-through, I think Catherine mentioned the state-dependent monetary policy impacts, the transmission mechanism. And we have been providing that in blogs, in inflation reports, in working papers to show how it affects our estimates of the output gap, of the neutral rates, why we have started hiking rates early after COVID. We also provide counterfactual exercises using our models and research. This is all part of like how policy is communicated, and it's using research as a backbone. But I wanted to talk a little bit more of, as I was mentioning, things that I think research could help. The first one is when to communicate, how to communicate, what to communicate, and if it in the end matters or not, if it's effective or not. The first one on when to communicate, So the graph on your right-hand side, you see that there's been a big increase on the number of speeches. And we all agree that policy has to be transparent, you have to explain what you're doing. But what's the impact of giving one more speech? You know, what's the trade-off? What's the value of providing one more speech? That's one aspect. And the other one is when you think about monetary policy meetings, we have gone to the other extreme. So speeches are sort of state-dependent. Each member decides when it does. And then when you think about when setting the interest rate, it's quite the opposite. Almost all countries have gone for 8 meetings. And I mean, it's not quite clear all of them should be 8 meetings because the shocks are different, the persistence is different of the shocks. But we have all gone for this equilibrium of 8 meetings and completely flexible in speeches. I don't know if it makes sense or not and what's the rationale. The second one is how to communicate, and I think there's been some good research on that, on trying to tackle different population, the fact that minutes have been deeper and longer, but at the same time you want to get population that it's not, you know, PhD in economics could understand what's going on. And here I provide like 2 layers. I think McMahon provides this. The fact that on the minutes, it's getting longer and it's getting more complicated to understand it. But on the other hand, you have more of these visual summaries. I think the ECB has it. The Central Bank of Brazil recently implemented too, trying to explain it to the population. Still up for debate, what's the impact of it? You know, if it affects, for instance, the power of monetary policy, when you provide more transparency on getting into not only the PhDs. The third is the noise on the communication itself. So the fact that when a central bank is providing a message, it's getting its scenario, trying to encode it, providing a diagnostics, and then trying to offer it to the receiver, right? So there's encoding and decoding of this message to send it to receiver. So there's a bit of the signaling. So my point is the literature looks much more on this fact, private information of the central bank and so on, but maybe it's more about encoding and decoding. Why do I mention that? So the graph on the right-hand side, it's a paper that I've been working on with the staff at the Central Bank of Brazil. So we looked at how effective or how useful is text from the Fed to forecast interest rates, growth, inflation, and so on. So we start saying, look, let's run a VAR, usual VAR, and add the statements. Does it improve your forecast? It does. When you add minutes, does it improve your forecast? It does improve your forecast. You understand more about what the Fed is doing. But once you start getting into the speeches, it's not helping much. So there's probably a point in which there is an inflection in which you're providing more noise than signal. So there's say too much transparency in a sense, okay? So you see that in the end there's a negative impact on forecast evaluation when you're adding speeches from not FOMC to forecast interest rates. And in the end, to finish off my point, we have a lot of research to think about what's the impact of, say, a given decision on policy rate, what's going to be the impact on growth and so on. But it's much harder, for instance, when you're writing a statement to see what's going to be the impact. It's hard to know ex ante an evaluation of the statement to see what's the benchmark, what people are expecting, and then you provide a text and say, so in the end, as people say, is it dove or is it hawk? I mean, you have to try to figure out what's going to be priced in given your text, and maybe research could try to to help on that, on trying to provide an ex-ante evaluation of a benchmark of a text. I think that would be also important for policy. That's it. Thank you.
I'm not sure, do we have microphones? We're a bit late, but we shifted around one program point, so we can go a bit over time and start the next panel later. Are there questions in the audience? So while maybe the audience is thinking about questions, I mean, we've seen right? We've outlined the principles, the importance, and how sort of research can be put into practice in policy relevant contexts. But what I wanted to know is like, so maybe let me start with Luc. Actually, how could, like, if you have a fresh PhD, what are like the few things that you would really tell the PhD to, starting at the ECB, to sort of change from coming from an academic background to a policy background? I mean...
Okay, so thanks for the question. So there are a couple of things. First is, just like when you present your paper, it's important to know your audience. And here you're going to face a very different audience. So you may be lucky you face one of the dear colleagues on my left and right-hand side. They are PhD economists. Well, but more likely than not, than that, you may face someone who doesn't have innate knowledge of the models that you are working with. Second, even if you do, you may face Kathy's high demand of, well, please don't give me these linearities and all the other stuff, but okay, that's the workhorse model that most of us work with. And third is indeed, I think it's ultimately, you need to be useful to this policymaker. You want to be invited back. And what that means is you have to step outside of your paper, outside of your model. Then it gets very scary because typically we hide behind the research, but now you actually need to, you put yourself into her shoes, be useful, put things in there that you have not been able to analyze. And that's where I come with this also important message that you have to have the guts to sometimes say, I don't know. Don't make it up and then say, I will go back and I will send you an email about that and go and ask or analyze further. So these are a couple of examples of what would be helpful. Now, all of that means you need to develop very thick skin. So Kathy says, okay, state dependence or not. I mean, I remember going to Mario Draghi, this is, with one of my researchers who was making this advice. Now we need to move from time to state-dependent forward guidance, and we were thrown out of the office after trying for 15 minutes, and we were called back 3 months later. So, develop thick skin.
So, you also need crisis to punch through previous thinking.
Yes.
So there's this, again, if anybody has a question, just raise your hand and I'll give you the word. In the meantime, we'll just continue our discussion here. Maybe, so at the board level, Diogo, how can, what are the things you can do to sort of create the conditions for good research? Kathy said, right, the credibility of an institution is the credibility of an research. But how do we generate conditions that there is credible research and that gets acknowledged?
Right. So I think the first one is for the board to be patient. I really think about it. It's we try to get things for the next meeting for a month or a month and a half. That's the longest that we accept a policy work or starting a research work, and it's not like that. So the first one is avoiding zigzagging and being patient. So all this means providing the right incentives. You were talking about a good ranking, a ranking that matters. I think this is important. The split of policy and research, I think it's super relevant to get good research. And the third one is providing the right infrastructure. And infrastructure meaning here data policy, how to use data. I think this all helps. To finalize, given that you have the incentives, you have the data, and you have the questions, it's really about how to communicate the board with the staff with the board being open on that. I think this is all quite important, actually.
Thanks.
Could I just make a couple points here? One is, I don't think of myself as a scary person, right? I don't think of myself as scary. I have office hours. I encourage people to come in and tell me what they think is interesting, and then we talk about it. So that's the kind of, information exchange. It's kind of like being a professor. I'm basically a professor. I just happen to also make monetary policy decisions. So, thinking of that, in that kind of relationship, dials down a little bit some of this issue. It also means that as people do research, especially when I'm interacting with staff, I always say, come to me when it's half done. Don't come to me when it's already done and your life depends on it. Because, I know what half-done research looks like. I have PhDs that I still coach and mentor. So I know what half-done stuff looks like, and I'm not gonna chew it up. But it's also true that at mid-course corrections with research can make it better fit for my purpose without making it not a research paper. So you can think about it's a product. It has different brands. There's the policy brand, and then there's the journal brand. And the two of them don't have to be diametrically opposite or opposing each other at all. That's something you were saying, Luc, about finding the synergies between your ongoing research program and the policy program. Those synergies, in my view, are very, very deep, and more often than not can be exploited effectively, both for the journal output as well as for the policy output. And the last point on be patient. Okay, we like to be patient, but again, that sort of goes back to tell me what you're working on and why you think I need to know about it.
Maybe we can summarize this. It's not be patient, but be steady, right? I mean, as central bank management gets a lot of external pressure, and you just need to hold the ship steady, so right that the people on board can sit on their desk without too much going left and right. And I think actually there's another thing there that you have researchers, probably in this room we have very good representation, that are career central bankers, but obviously the vast majority of policy relevant research, I think it's still the majority happens in academia, and I notice, and it goes right, like there are frictions, right? People have a different value system in academia and in policy. Maybe, Kathy, sort of what's the as a person moving between academia back and forth, what are sort of the main lessons, like the frictions, the issues that you have encountered, or what's the benefit of having this interchange, and how can we foster it?
Well, the benefits, of course, is that you have a broader network, and therefore you can help foster co-authorship, which is very much exploiting the inside data that is often proprietary and not available with researchers from an academic environment who have a little bit more time to and extend the time to work on what is the journal version of a paper. So I think that, that networking is a critical way to both functionally exploit the transition from one environment to another, as well as produce product that is valuable to both.
Thanks.
There's a question
There's
up
a,
here.
oh, okay, there was, I think this was first and then we have.
Okay, sorry. Hello. Yeah, my question goes in the direction of the governance of research. I mean, Luc was talking about that there are two broad models, basically the integrated model and the other one in which you have like a very clear division of labor within the bank. So my question is basically like, how do you do it in the integrated model to enforce research time, basically? Because I mean, there's always a temptation from management to increase the demands of policy work, or even like it's hard for people that do a lot of policy work to continue with the flow of research. I mean, you have to keep track of what you were doing, like, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, and it's hard, and I don't know. That's basically the question. I mean, how do you enforce it? And my impression is that sometimes it's better to basically anchor expectations from the outset, in the sense that some people will do policy research mostly, and other research, academic research, and that's it, basically.
Okay, good. I don't think there's a silver bullet, but as I said, I think it's important that if you go for the integrated model, that there's a clear contract, which some central banks have, where it actually says there's so much research time left. So for instance, the Dutch central bank just did away with its research department, freaking out the community a little bit. But what they have ensured in the new setup, where it's an integrated model, that researchers have minimum of 50% research time. So you have basically an integrated model, but you still have two types of jobs, contracts within that policy department. 50% minimum is actually quite a lot. It's more than some separate research departments have. So. But all of that, of course, only works if the mindset of the whole institution is supportive of research. And so, we all want to be in a world where you have policymakers that have a background and that have a low entry barrier to approach. It's not always like that. And then it can be very dangerous. So the most dangerous is to build an integrated model just around a bunch of individuals that happen to be there at that point in time. And they have a research background and support research. If they leave, maybe different. So, of course, the separate model from a pure research perspective is always going to be safer. But I come from the perspective that you can also make it work, but you need to have very clear incentives in place and the right people.
Or maybe.
Thank you very much. This is a great panel. My question is slightly different and goes more to the notion of groupthink and how to preserve independent thinking on the research side within a central bank. Because as Luc mentioned, I mean, you have to develop a thick skin when you go and perhaps say things that are uncomfortable to policymakers. So how can central banks establish safeguards to prevent groupthink from happening on the research front?
It helps to have diversity of views on the policy-making front, right? To the extent that those who have to make decisions have diverse backgrounds and interests, that helps to contribute to diversity within the research as well. I think that's kind of key factor. I want to comment a bit on the research, the protection of research, because I've also been at multiple institutions. It's not just central banks that have issues about balancing, protecting research time, quote, quote, from policymaking demands, and multiple strategies, the integrated versus the separate. One item that has not been brought up is that one type of contract involves secondments, or you get 6 months being in an academic environment, or, you know, you get a year in an academic environment and, you know, just step back. It's like either a secondment or a time off to pursue, you know, some more strict 100% research. So that is one model that at various times the Federal Reserve Board in Washington has pursued. So that's good. The flip side is that this might sound cruel, but there are a variety of people out there who think they're great researchers, and they aren't. They're just not. And, you know, how long do you kind of give people an opportunity to do research, and there is not a lot to show for it? And at some point, you have to, you know, you have to call that and put them on another task. And those people are going to be very upset about it, but they're not good researchers, and they shouldn't be taking up the slot of somebody who could be. So that's kind of one of those management tasks that I've had to do at various times.
Oh, please.
So actually the advantage on the latter is in the central bank, there are other jobs than
Yes.
research, and in academia there's a lot of dead wood. I think I want to come back on this question of, you know, how to avoid groupthink. It's of course a constant battle, and it's a really, really important battle. And actually, it's probably one of the main reasons why at the ECB we have a separate research department. One of the things we actively try to do is we have a product called Research Perspectives. So we take a topic, whatever, fiscal monetary interactions. I mean, I'm sure in this room there are wildly different views around the table. And we put together a team where we know there are wildly different views, and they get to work together on that for 6 months. And that is a bit of a safeguard. Assigning multiple groups, or if you have multiple departments, also helps. And so we do sometimes, at the risk of overlap, have some duplication of efforts in the institution. But of course you need to manage it in a way that you let people know it's totally fine to disagree. And my main job is to preserve balance, and that's one of the implicit contracts I have with my board members. And even though they will push in one or the other direction, we are allowed to push back. But that's some sort of way of working you have to develop, and is super, super important.
Thanks. So we have one question. Let's close with that, and then so we can go to the other panel.
Yes, okay, thank you. So I have a question, just some curiosity maybe to get some insights into policy making from being a normal staff member here. So how do you ensure a right balance between quality of the research you use in your policy making and speed, basically? Because I suppose that if you had to have all research going through peer reviews of international journals, I would think that quite frequently it wouldn't be that relevant anymore when you have to take the policy decisions. I'm thinking also, just referring back to the recent energy crisis. So, but on the other hand, as a policymaker, maybe you wouldn't have the necessary time to basically go thoroughly through every research input you get from your staff to ensure that it has the right quality to actually affect your decision making. So I'm just curious to get a little bit of insight how you strike the right balance here. Thanks.
I can respond to that. Yeah, if we waited for the peer review process, you know, we'd be way behind the curve. But keep in mind that within the structure of a research department, there is a lot of internal peer review, both by people at the same level as they compare notes on and compare their research. There's internal seminars, and there's also some management peer review as well. From my standpoint, as I said before, I like to see things before they're fully gelled, because I think in some cases I have a pretty good idea of where it's going to go. I mean, I've kind of been in the business for a long time, and I kind of know what's going to work and what's not going to work. So I have my own judgment that I incorporate into my assessment of the research that I incorporate into my work, my decision-making.
And agreeing with you, I mean, I also like to see the research have done, and I think it's important for both sides knowing what it means to be have done. When the researcher brings, he or she also knows like what it means to be have done, what it's left, and it's important to be open and upfront about it. And then the board member also looks at it, knows that it's have done, and also adds to it a grain of salt. But I think it's good to have it and have this exchange on both sides.
Maybe.
So I think it helps to think of what you were asking, not as two different products, but basically as different stages of the same product. So in our context, it's you first get a policy assignment, and when you're sort of at this halfway stage, which typically has to be less than 3 months. I mean, that's the total max, rather 6 weeks. You do the early brief, and the early brief gets developed into a working paper with the aim to publish later on. You mark your territory, and then you get the whole 3-year refereeing stages. So there's just different stages in some way.
Yeah, I want to very much second that. Like at the BS, right, you have an integrated model. You get a lot of policy work, and the art is to churn out working papers out of your policy work. Of course, you need to acknowledge that unless you're exceptionally lucky, most of that stuff is not going to go very high in academic publishing. So you need to sort of differentiate a bit, right? And have some projects that have some that are on a slower track and go deeper, and others that are as policy usable as possible. Let's do one last thing. I want to thank you for this excellent panel. I want to thank you for these excellent questions. Could each of you give me just a topic? The one topic that you'd suggest to people in this room or to any researcher interested in policy-relevant research, what's a key topic that one could start right now? Kathy.
So I mentioned 2 at the end of my commentary. One was incorporating volatility in higher moments of the distributions in everything that we do. But the other one that I think, and I think people are already working on that, so the other one is policy spillovers associated with divergence. Now, divergence in the policy rate is something that I think people are definitely working on. The channels of the way in which that policy rate divergence may be manifest. But I think something that has not quite hit as much of the radar is, and I'll say it again, is many central banks are also pursuing balance sheet policies. Some of them think they're more integrated into the overall financial conditions index or monetary policy conditions index than others, but a lot of them are doing it one way or another. So they are all going to, at some point, hit a reserves boundary, and how that they figure out what that reserves boundary might be, and what is the institutional structure for what happens when that boundary is hit. Different central banks have different approaches to when you're there, what is your institutional framework for avoiding messing up financial markets. And if we don't have the same institutional structure across different central banks, then I think we could be looking at some pretty interesting financial market volatility, which goes back to the first question.
I always hang 10 topics every year on the wall, so it's difficult for me to give you one, but let me then try to give you the top one. Basically, anything that challenges the workhorse models that we have at central banks, and so a big question is the non-neutrality of monetary policy.
Yes. Excellent.
Communication I've mentioned, and I think use of data for sort of nowcasting, payment systems. We've been doing a lot of that in Brazil now.
Thank you.